Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm about to pass it off to Ian Houston, our executive director, but we're just thrilled to have Mr. Gedda. So, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to welcome you here at AFSA. We were just talking about the renovation of the building and the way that we renovated it to design it to have these sorts of functions that allow us to talk about diplomacy, foreign service, etc. So most conducive to these sorts of conversations. My name is Ian Houston. I'm the executive director here at AFSA, and we appreciate you attending here for what we call our Book Notes program. This is a series that we implemented a couple of years ago, and we're pleased to have you all here with us. It's really my pleasure to introduce George Gedda, who will be discussing his book, The State Department, More Than Just Diplomacy, and where he recounts his 40 years as a reporter covering the State Department. And I think one of his former colleagues is actually here today. So that's quite a career. So thank you for being here, George. George spent almost his entire career with the Associated Press, working primarily in Washington. He accompanied 9 Secretaries of State on trips to 88 countries. And so he's been putting in quite a bit of time there. He is also the author of numerous articles and books recounting his experiences overall. George retired in 2007, and he now lives in Florida. So everyone, please welcome George for a discussion about his book.
Thank you, Ian. After that very articulate, well-enunciated introduction, I feel a little self-conscious. I arrived in Washington in 1968. I was a pea-green 27-year-old assigned to cover the State Department, focusing on Latin America. And I branched out to eventually cover all the continents, at least from the State Department perspective. And thanks to my employer, the Associated Press, I was able to visit 88 countries, mostly in the company of Secretaries of State, starting with Cyrus Vance and ending with Condoleezza Rice. So I feel blessed to have had that opportunity during all those years, and I retired in 2007. I was very impressed by the elegance of the 8th floor upstairs across the street. And it's chandeliers and high ceilings, and the purple colors. I think I don't know how many there are, but there are quite a few. It's very imposing. And the Secretaries of State should never feel uncomfortable about inviting kings and queens, not to mention prime ministers, up for lunch or whatever in that particular setting. Below the 8th floor is where the work of the State Department is done. This description by American Diplomacy magazine, quote, a diplomat can say the nastiest things in the nicest way, or he or she can tell you to go to hell so tactfully that you look forward to the trip. And a diplomat who forgot his wife's birthday told her how can I remember your birthday when you never seem to get older? Now, that's probably apocryphal, but you get the idea. Oh, I'd like to acknowledge some people who are here. Ed and Nancy are in California to say hello, and there's Brian Carlson, who's a friend for many years at the State Department. My daughters are here. There's Sarah sitting next to Ed, and there's Debbie, and there's Dennis Hayes, who was a Cuba expert for many years at the State Department, and with whom I, invariably when I see Dennis, the subject within a matter of minutes turns to Cuba, because it's the one of the most fascinating countries in the world, and I tend to think totalitarian countries are more interesting than dictatorships, although I wouldn't want to live in one. And there are other people I should acknowledge, but I should move on. A diplomat will approach every question with an open mouth, according to wags, as they say, or he will lay down your life for his country. I traveled with every Secretary of State from Cyrus Vance to Condoleezza Rice. 88 countries, all continents. Kissinger was perhaps the most memorable of the Secretaries of State that I covered, although I was a bit young at the time. I did not appreciate the full depth and grandeur of Henry Kissinger. He was I was only in my early 30s when he came on board, and it's probably no surprise to say that he was the smartest, most intellectual, funniest Secretary of State that I covered, and his one-liners were legion. This is a story about Winston Lord. Some of you may remember the name. He wrote a paper or a speech requested by the secretary, and he turns it over to Kissinger. And the next day, Kissinger hands it back to him, and says it needs work. And Lord was back the second day. Kissinger hands it back to him and says, "Keep at it." On the third day, Lord returns, and Kissinger says, "This one I'll read." The problem with that is it's believable. He was secretary from 69 to 77 with, he was NSC advisor and/or Secretary of State between 69 and 77. That was the easiest way to put it. And I think if Ford had been reelected in 76, Kissinger would have served another 4 years, because I have a feeling that Ford would have kept him. When he had held down both the NSC job and the State Department job, somebody from the White House press said to him, as he was walking in to the press room at the White House, and he asked Kissinger, "What's it like being so close to power?" So Kissinger said, "What do you mean close?" And there was an unveiling of a statue on the, I guess, the 8th floor of the State Department. And Kissinger was asked to do the honors, to pull the cord, to expose whoever it was. I think it was Thomas Jefferson. And because, I mean, it was in the Jefferson room, so that's logical. And so Kissinger does the honors and stands back and looks, and he says, "Oh, I thought it would be me." The press was fascinated by Henry Kissinger. 7 colleagues of mine got together and bought a horse. They called him Henry the K. And and Kissinger would ask one of the group thereafter, "How's my horse?" in a jaunty manner. And then this nag finished 7th in a race, and Kissinger approached one of the owners and asked, "How's your horse?" You can imagine that, those of you who have been around long enough. Nicholas Daniloff of UPI, who was covered the State Department for years before UPI went under. They may be still around in some form or another, but they were our competitor of the Associated Press for decades. And covered the State Department, smart guy, wrote a story, and Kissinger's attitude toward the story was evident when he said, "Mr. Daniloff, you are a receptacle into which garbage has been poured." Kissinger's press conferences obviously were always well attended. They used the Loy Henderson room for all of his news conferences because he was such a figure around Washington for so many reasons. And his brilliance and his accent and his habit of hanging around with beautiful women. Somebody asked him one time, "What's your secret, Mr. Secretary?" He said, "Power is a great aphrodisiac." It was always an anxious time for the press office when he held a news conference. There were these scores of reporters who would show up in the Loy Henderson room, including many foreign reporters, and there was always a lot of anxiety that some hothead would get up and shout a very embarrassing question, ideologically based, either from a communist country or an Arab country with ill feelings toward the U.S., but however present that may have been in the minds of the press office, it never happened. Cy Vance was the successor to Henry Kissinger. The two individuals could not have been more unlike. Vance was noblesse oblige, New York, lawyer, kind, gracious, smiling, possessing many of the qualities that Kissinger had. I don't mean to say that Kissinger was a negative presence in comparison to Vance. Kissinger simply had different qualities. Prime among them was his brilliance, which nobody could possibly deny. He once wrote another one of his thick books, and a British reviewer was asked what he, as he was about to read the book, he said, asked a question about the book, and he said, well, I don't know if this is a great book or not, but anybody who finishes it is a great reader. And it is dense stuff. It is dense stuff, and you're just awed by every line. Not that I ever waded through one of these books, but I know that every line, almost every line, is weighty. Kissinger had a dog named Tyler. An aide to Kissinger, his name was Jacoby, went to Kissinger's house because Kissinger needed somebody to watch the dog while he was away one day on a Saturday. So he knocked at the door at 7 a.m. and Kissinger was kind of anxious, you know, about his dog Tyler. I don't know where the Tyler is, but I think it was John Tyler for some reason, the former president of the 19th century. Anyway, Kissinger wanted to question Colby closely about what was in store for Tyler that day. What are you going to do with him? So Colby said, well, I'm going to take him to Virginia. What are you going to do in Virginia? He said, well, I'm going to skydive. And Kissinger says, well, suppose something happens to you. What's going to happen to Tyler? The implication being, who cares about you? You could splat on the ground like a pancake. What really counts is my dog, Tyler. So, of course, Cody's always be fine, he'll be fine, don't worry about it. And you have to sort of weigh Kissinger against the background of, does he really mean this when he says this? That he's more worried about his dog than his. and then Jacoby or anybody else. And I think people who know Kissinger best, some would say, well, he was only kidding. He really didn't mean that about Colby. And others would say, well, I'm not so sure about that. He wrote a book, it was one of those 800-page masterpieces, very deep. I don't know how many people read it, but it looks good on somebody's bookshelf, you know. And a British reviewer commented, I don't know if it's a great read, but anyone finishing it is a great reader. He never lost his German accent. He came here in 1938 with his brother. He got off the boat in 1938 at age 23. And his brother was Walter, who became a highly successful lawyer on Long Island. And he spoke perfect English, accent-free English, in contrast to his brother. But he seemed very self-assured and wasn't fazed at all, it seemed, by the fact that his brother was the famous Henry Kissinger. He seemed very secure with himself. And Kissinger made fun of his accent from time to time, and even made fun of the German accent which he inherited. And he went to Germany once, and spoke to a group of German reporters in German. And at night, in his hotel room, he watched himself on TV and discovered, he said, that he spoke German with a Swedish accent. Kissinger redefined the role of the National Security Council when he was there. You know, the National Security Council was normally a low-key job, but you know, he just made it into something big. And the good thing about it is that he could make it into something big and never have to be summoned before the Congress. And that duty befell the Secretary of State, William P. Rogers, around whom Kissinger obviously ran rings. And I think it was very uncomfortable for Rogers serving in the same administration as Kissinger. And I think that Nixon hired Rogers knowing what would happen, knowing that Rogers would be second fiddle, but as a longtime friend, he expected Rogers to sort of take one for the team because Kissinger was so valuable to Nixon in so many ways. And look at the events that occurred during Kissinger's tenure at the NSC, notably the breakthrough to China, in which Kissinger obviously played a major role. He made a secret visit to China in 1971, sneaking in to China through Pakistan, and when Kissinger finally was prepared to make the announcement, I think it was in August of 1971, I think there was a sense of breakthrough, and I think that the move was well received by the American public, that China, after more than 20 years in isolation, was now part of the equation. And I think this helped cement Nixon's role as a savvy foreign policy operative, and helped him with his, among other things, with his re-election the following year. Cyrus Vance, he was Secretary of State just for 2 years, 77 to 79. He had 77 to 78 very productive years. Panama Canal treaties, big breakthrough. Followed by the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, which was a landmark event, and obviously there were a lot of people who helped with that. But obviously it would have been impossible without Sadat risking his life. He paid for this with his life in 1980, it was probably the best thing that happened in terms of Middle East peace since Israel was born in '48. And how much Vance did behind the scenes, I don't know. I give full credit to Sadat for that. But Vance's last year was nightmarish. Starting with Carter's 1979 decision in October to admit the Shah. And nothing was the same after that for Carter. Vance objected, said shouldn't do that. And people like Kissinger said, you cannot turn your back on this man. He was a man who supported American policy for a generation, and you are duty-bound to admit the Shah to the United States. He was ill. He wanted to go to New York for treatment. Some of you old-timers probably remember that. And I think it was in the fall of 1979 that Carter made this decision, and over Vance's objectives, because he was worried about the embassy in Tehran, and he was exactly right. The Shah was admitted, I believe, on October 22nd, 1979, and on November 4th, the militants seized the embassy, and Vance was proved correct with his caution, and the ripple effect of that decision by Carter altered the course of history. It was 6 months later. It was an election year, 1980. People wanted the hostages, the 52 American hostages back. There were 66 at the outset. Women and African Americans were released. One other non-female, non-African American was released because of illness, leaving 52. And in April of 1980, under heavy pressure for the release of the hostages and under election primary pressure to get some results, I think there was 5 Democrats contesting Jimmy Carter for the Democratic nomination. There were a lot of things going wrong during his presidency: 14% interest rates, 14% inflation rates. So Carter was very much on the defensive, and obviously he wanted a victory, somebody to hang his head on for the November elections. And of course, he wanted the release of the hostages because I'm sure that it troubled him every day, irrespective of political considerations, because employees of this government were being held hostage, and the rescue operation took place over the objections of Cyrus Vance. Most of as far as I know, the rest of Carter's national security team felt he should go ahead with it, and whether this had anything to do with it or not, but I believe on April 13th, Vance and his wife took off to Florida on a vacation, and the day after was when Brzezinski and his allies started to move the ball on a rescue operation. And Vance came back and was dismayed that he was sort of handed this fait accompli. And he was counseling patient diplomacy, and patience was one thing that Jimmy Carter did not have in the spring of 1980, because the primaries were, primary season was on top of him, and he needed results, and what better way to improve his standing, not to mention win the release of the hostages, than through a rescue operation, which of course failed dismally and never came close to success. And the plan was to somehow seize the hostages who were still in the American embassy and take them to a soccer stadium nearby and have helicopters fly in and take them to safety. And obviously, they never got to first base with that plan. And Brzezinski wrote that he walked into Carter's office not long thereafter and found Carter with his head down near the desk, cupped in his hands, and obviously devastated by that turn of events. Not only did his grand idea blow up in his face, but those poor hostages would remain confined for who knows how long. And of course, as it turned out, they were finally released, I believe, right as the 81 inauguration was about to take place. And I think that the Ayatollah did not want to release hostages on Carter's watch. And nobody knew that was his bottom line at the time. Anyway, the hostages came back after 444 days, and Carter won 6 states in November. There were so many things that went wrong. Unemployment, inflation, hostages, and so he was gone, and Ronald Reagan came in, and Al Haig was the Secretary of State, and it was a very entertaining time for the State Department press corps. This man had a swagger, the likes of which have not been seen since, and he had an ongoing struggle with Cap Weinberger, as that was his nickname. Her name was Casper. Friends called him Cap. And everybody knew that there was there were disagreements, to say the least, between Weinberger and Haig, and Haig, and there was something called the crisis management team, and the question was who was going to head it, Weinberger or Haig, and I don't know how that was resolved. I don't know if there was ever an announcement as to how that would be resolved. Maybe it was dissolved. And it was a lot of. It was interesting for the press. It was not amusing to the President of the United States, I'm sure, to see this battle going on, and everybody knew it, and the press wrote about it, and Haig made light of it. I mean, can you imagine the Secretary of State saying something like, as Haig said at some point, probably in 1981, the other morning I had breakfast with Kemp. There was nobody there but him, me, and our tasters. Oh, you outside.
wondering if we should do a Q&A.
Debbie's advocated the Q&A. We're supposed to be out of here a little after 2. Hmm? A little after 3. Just testing. All right. I can continue, or if there are questions, raise your hand. Yes, Dennis.
Was there ever a story that got you into the doghouse with the then Secretary of State such that they either froze you out or tried to then co-opt you in as a way to kind of deal with the press stories?
I guess I was never that aggressive. I wish that were part of my resume. I was frozen out by Secretary X, Y, or Z. And you can start off this talk by boasting about the time that I was a target of the Secretary of State. But I worked for the Associated Press. We're supposed to cover the story and uncover stories, but not make waves in which you offend a lot of people. If you tell the truth, fine. That nobody can contest it. But it never reached that point with me or anybody else that I'm aware of. The ones that happened the most to, I suppose, were Woodward and Bernstein with their Watergate exposés in 1972, and they were right on with their reporting. And you can imagine how the White House wanted to destroy them. But I thank God for the system that we have, and because I've been to all of these countries, I know what it's like to live in a country where there are severe constraints on the press, and I would not want to live in a country in which the president was not totally free, and we are really blessed. And I assume you're all aware of that, and I hope most Americans are. And I hope happy 4th of July they should be saying, thank goodness. Yes, sir.
Would you care to comment on who you think is the most effective State Department spokesperson? Or a couple of them?
And the least.
And the least.
Most effective State Department spokesman. Well, gosh. I mean, they're all on short leashes. Well, I mean, I thought Richard Boucher was an effective Secretary of State. He was a spokesman. He was spokesman for 2 or 3 Secretaries of State, which shows the esteem in which he was held. And the press liked him. He was he served us well, and he served the secretaries well, and I suppose that's the ideal situation. A spokesman should never get the idea that we are his prime constituency. No, the secretary is his prime constituency, and everybody knows that he can just go as far with us as the secretary wants him to go. And of course, some were more agreeable than others. Some viewed us with more hostility than others. Some probably were more willing than others to answer phone calls from the press. Some were naturally more amiable than others. Richard was very amiable. So was Margaret Tutwiler. She was Baker's Secretary of State, but there was no doubt about who she was working for. She would sit on a block of ice for about an hour and a half with Jim Baker. And unhesitatingly. Others might, if asked to sit on a block of ice for an hour and a half, they might say, but why? I don't know if Margaret would ask why. Look, loyalists are good. Public figures are entitled to loyalty from the people who work under them, and that is very important. Question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, my daughter works for AP now, cover the UN right now.
Yep.
How would you characterize the difference between the AP when you first started out? I don't know how long ago that was, and the AP now in terms of coverage of foreign affairs. Or is there any difference?
Wow, that's hard. Well, coverage of foreign affairs, I would say that coverage of the State Department hasn't changed much. You know, we usually send a couple of people to the briefing every day, and that's been true for years. As a matter of fact, in the old days, we used to send more people to the briefing than we do now, because we had regional experts. We had a guy who watched out for Asian news and would write stories tailored to Asian newspapers, Asian audiences. We had another fellow who specialized in the Middle East and Europe, and I did Latin America. But you know, some stories were told exclusively for those regions. Other stories were designed for the American press. I don't know if I've answered your question. Okay. Yes, sir.
George, one of the things that you've written a lot about is U.S. administration policy vis-a-vis Cuba. I think you wrote an article in the Foreign Service Journal about it.
Yeah.
How would you characterize the forces of resistance to evolution and change in U.S.-Cuba policy, and how strong are they now? What's your prognosis for the current situation?
Well, I see stalemate because if the U.S. and Cuba were to get together, what would they talk about? Are there issues such as vessel safety in the Caribbean between the two countries? Obviously, there's always room for that kind of discussion. But is there room for talking about flexibility on the Cuban side with respect to their political system, with respect to the freedoms that they allow or don't allow? I mean, this is a non-starter. I mean, the negotiations wouldn't get to first base. It's just very difficult to talk about a country's internal situation with the leaders of that country. That's their business. And that's certainly the way Cuba sees their situation, and we would see the same situation. We would respond the same way to anybody who questioned the way we do things here. Now, I mean, but the question may be timely because Raul Castro turned 83 in July, I believe. I don't know how well he is. Fidel, of course, is 88. And it is possible that the mood will change. There might be a greater willingness on Cuba's part. The trouble is, Cuba is a terribly needy country. The living standards are low. I've been there 31 times. And there are very, very few luxuries in Cuba. You get, a couple of pair of pants a year and a couple of shirts a year, and the racing system is alive and well. And there are no luxuries unless you consider long speeches to be a luxury. I don't know what will happen when the Castros are no longer on the scene. I don't know whether the Cuban people will demonstrate a freedom now type of attitude, or whether they are so inculcated by the existing mantra of how things are run. But physically, I just don't think he's with it. I don't know when the last picture of him in public has been shown in the media. It's been quite a while.
Think of when Chavez was there, and then we meeting with Chavez a couple of years ago.
The picture of Fidel?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's quite a while ago.
But
Yep.
what about change on the American side? Do you sense among the Cuban Americans, the new generation has a different attitude than Jorge Mascarosa did?
Oh, I mean, I think that's they want invasion tomorrow. That generation is dying off. They don't have nearly the influence that they do now. There's no sentiment for that. The people who lost property, I mean, let's face it, the Castros were thieves. They stole billions of dollars in American property and Cuban property, and that should not be forgotten. And whether whether a future Cuban government would be willing to, we're getting the high sign, would be willing to broach this issue, I just don't know. And how aggressive an American administration would be in pursuing this. I think that they had to be, there should be some gesture in that direction, simply because of the magnitude of the theft involved. So, Debbie was here signaling.
One more question.
One more question. Ed?
On March 30, 81, when Reagan was shot, didn't Haig erroneously say, "I'm in charge"? I'm wondering how the press treated that.
I'm in charge here at the White House, was his exact quote. And he said it nervously. And, well, the press was bemused by it. And I think some thought it was gratuitous. It's probably would have been, Vice President Bush was out of Washington at the time. He was in the Midwest. So I guess was all too happy to fill that void, Al Haig. And but anyway, it became a moot point quickly when it was discovered, I think, not too long after that day, March 30th, that Reagan would be okay. But that's Al Haig for you. All right. Maybe he said one more, and I guess, is that it?
That was a short question, maybe one more.
Yes, ma'am.
I, as a young press officer for the State Department, what advice do you have for working effectively with journalists?
Leak.
Yeah.
Look, you will be under, as I'm sure you're aware, under very tight constraints. Because this, the interest of 100 and how many countries around the world are at stake, and they don't want any surprises to appear in the press. A State Department official who asked not to be identified said, who said that, And I think that's happened more than once over the years, that somebody said something on background that was incorrect. So what advice do I have for you? I said leak. Okay, I know you can't do that. Just make sure when you talk to the press that what you say is authorized. I can tell you the following, and it probably should be written out and vetted by a superior. And I mean, some of my ex-colleagues would feel disappointed by talking to you like this, but it's just not in your interest to sort of have a casual conversation about your thoughts on this, that, or the other issue, because it's liable to wind up in print. And your thoughts don't count as much as what the policy is. And if you're a loyal civil servant, and I'm sure you are, you will simply echo the party line, and that's what you're paid to do, and that's the understanding, and that's the only way the system can work is that. And the only way our system can work is if we have a press that's totally free to report what it wants. I think it's a fine system. Okay. There's a clamor for one more.
You mentioned loyalty, and I was to superiors or supervisors, and I was wondering if you feel that definition of loyalty has changed.
Definition of loyalty has changed. Well, no.
Concept of it.
I mean, loyalty traditionally has meant, loyalty to the flag, to the country. And of course, that's unchanged, I don't think. Do you have a different definition?
No, I just meant in terms of it seems that increasingly people are more willing to, in the past, I think Leon Panetta would probably be the most recent example, but people seem much more likely to air disagreements with people they work for than they used to, or it just seems that much more public.
Oh.
You mean while they're still, for example,
Why
someone
they're
is
still
in
serving,
office?
right, why they're
Oh,
still in
no.
office. I'm just saying that seemed to be, growing up, I don't seem to recall that as often.
Did people who left office, were they more willing in the old days to have a tell-all book?
And people will always tell all, but I think before there was a sense of out of loyalty, they might handle it differently, and now there's less of a sense of loyalty and more of a sense, well, these are really burning issues that have to get out, so that the balance seems to have.
All right. Maybe there was more of an inclination earlier to wait, to allow a decent interval to pass before you vent. Panetta obviously has decided he can't wait. And I'd like to know what his reasons were. He really feels he has something important to say. Okay, that's fine. He wants to sell more books. It could be. I don't know whether he's said things that are inappropriate and embarrass the colleagues that he had in the administration or not. I just don't know enough about it. Okay, maybe this is the last.
Yeah, well, this is kind of following up on some of these questions, but what was your opinion of the Edward Snowden affair? And if someone came to you with, like, this Edward Snowden had come to you, would you have worked with him and printed what you wanted, or?
No.
Okay, 'cause it seems like you take him like, that's what I was.
No, I mean, what he did was disreputable. And government expects loyalty from the people it hires. And he violated that tenet, and he's now living in Russia. And he should be prosecuted if he comes back. The trust factor was violated.
Yeah, what about the press though? I mean, that's his role.
No,
Do you think that the press has?
Hey, no. Press has to go with it for competitive reasons. If you don't write the story, the other guy will. Oh yeah, that's fair game. It's fair game.